We have an interesting thing here at the first reading and the second in the gospel. In the first reading, we have the story of Joseph and his brothers, his 11 brothers, which, by the way, they also had a sister named Dinah. So there was actually 13 kids with Israel, 1 girl, 12 boys. And in this family, there was a lot of dysfunction, to say the least. Obviously, right? The father is doting over the 11th boy down and gives him a special coat, which incites within the brothers an intense jealousy that leads to envy. And then the Lord tells the parable of the tenants, and he's speaking about himself here, but he's actually trying to point out the greed of the Pharisees, the greed of the fact that they're not giving the Lord the harvest. They want it all for themselves. And again, the greed leads to rage. And so we see these two sins of greed and envy, these two capital sins, greed and envy, that both produce the third, or I should say a third vice, and that is wrath. In both situations, it led to wrath. In the gospel parable, in their greed, they want it all for themselves. They don't want to give the master what is truly his, since they're just a tenant and they have to give, but they don't want to. And so in trying to keep it for themselves, they turn to wrath. Greed will always turn to wrath to either protect what it has or to get what it wants. Greed will always have the effect of wrath. It'll always bring forth wrath. You kind of consider them kind of like sisters, the two of them. They get along very well. If there is envy, it's the same thing. Envy is also very close to wrath, because when we're envious of others, we're not just jealous for what they have, we're angry because they have it and we don't. And envy begins to start to hate the person for what they have, and so that envy is turning again to wrath. You see in the gospel, what was the result of the greed? The greed led to stoning, to beating, to killing, to eventually, in the parable, the murder of the son of the owner of the vineyard, Christ Jesus, right? That greed led to wrath, and the fruits of wrath was death, violence. And we see the same thing with that envy with Joseph and his brothers. Their brothers are envious of him. They want what he has. They want the affection of their father and so forth. And they're so envious of him that they want to kill him. It begins with beating, with violence. And then they throw the brother out. They throw him away into a well in a cistern. And then comes the brilliant idea, well, let's just sell him into this slavery so we don't kill him. Like, okay, Judah, nice idea. Like, where'd you come up with that one? And so they sell their own brother into slavery. It's kind of interesting because Jesus descends from the line of Judah, who came up with that bright idea. Judah is Jesus' great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather going back a few generations. That line of Judah. Now, he does save his brother from death, Judah. However, that jealousy, that envy that was there led to that anger, that violence. It leads to wrath, and the fruit of wrath is always violence and eventually death. And we know this in our own lives. We know in our own lives when we're being greedy with things, we want to protect what we have, or if we want more of something, we go after it and we get it, and we step on people to get that, or we hurt people to protect it. We don't share, are not self-gift and giving and so forth. And, enough is never enough, as they say, right? When we're greedy, enough is never enough. And sometimes it's not a matter of things we're holding on to. Sometimes it's a matter of power that we want. Is this part of the political problem we have? Is people are always seeking power, and power is never enough power. They need more power, and then more power. They want to hold on to it, so they'll do whatever to maintain that power. This has been the plague of regimes for centuries. Greed is such a terrible sin because it leads to such violence and such hatred. And maybe the same thing with envy. Like when we're envious, right? In our own hearts, we know that. We start feeling these things towards others because we want what they have, and we don't like that they have it. So there's that envy, that hatred for that person because they have it. And there's that, it becomes so personalized. Now, Now, we may never do physical violence to the person, but certainly there's the mental violence we do in our minds. We can think about lots of things we'd like to see happen to them. We can think about how, they could, something could happen and we can get what they have or whatever. There's kind of that mental violence that goes on there. We call that moral theology, delectatio morosa, delighting in evil, but it goes into the mind. But it also can come out of the tongue. We may never physically hurt anybody, but certainly the tongue is a very powerful sword. That's why sometimes when we're speaking about situations with people, we should be careful. It's not coming out of envy or greed. It's not wrath that's seeking to slice people apart, seeking to beat them, seeking to stone them with our mouths, and perhaps even murder them, murder their reputations with our mouths. It's so easy to fall into, and sometimes we're even blind to our own motives. It's just a reality of life, And so it's always good for us to examine our conscience and examine why we're feeling what we're feeling, why we're saying what we're saying, what we're thinking. Not all thoughts we think should be thunk. Some of them have to be checked to make sure we don't fall into or allow pride or greed or envy to reach our hearts where it starts coming out in that wrath and that violence of our thoughts, the violence in our words, the violence in our actions, or even violence in our inaction. After the boys threw their brother into the well, the decision was to do nothing, just let him die there. An inaction. Now, Reuben tries to save him, and we don't know why Reuben was trying to save him. Perhaps Reuben thought, if I rescue him out of that well, bring him home to Dad, I'll be top dog. I don't know. Whether it came out of his own envy or if it came out of his own, true love for his little brother. We don't know that because Reuben wasn't always so good himself. He had a few issues. Another homily for another day. He was certainly trying to get, to that top position where he was going to get the inheritance. And, but that's another story of another day. But that envy, that type of wrath can lead to a do nothing. If I do nothing, well, then they could just continue hurting if I don't help them. It's also, doing nothing is also a form of violence, as we saw in yesterday's gospel, right? The rich man and Lazarus. Rich man, we could say, was very violent in the fact that he did nothing in his sloth and his laziness, stepping over the poor man at his door. It was rather an act of violence, and that he was letting this man starve to death at his door. Anyway, today, we ask the good Lord to really purify our hearts of any envy, any greed that could anyway lead to any kind of wrath, any form of wrath, any fruits of wrath. That our hearts truly be purified before the Lord our God, that we truly learn to be persons capable of being happy for those who have what they have and being happy with what the Lord has given to us. In peace and gratefulness of what the Lord has granted to us, greed dissipates. In being happy for others and what they have and giving thanks to God for how God blessed them, envy dissipates. Gratefulness is the answer and the remedy to both of those evils. A grateful heart. May God bless you and Mary keep you.